Hello everyone! Today we are going to have some fun. We are going to go over some of the dumbest things that I was ever told, a lot of which I used to believe, while I was a right-wing Christian fundamentalist. This is not going to be a serious debunking video. This is going to be a bit more fast-paced than that. This is more about just going over some of the shit that I was exposed to that was so far out there that it doesn't even warrant a sincere conversation. A lot of this is shit that I used to hear in fundamentalist, young earth creationist circles back when I was a child that I don't really hear anyone talking about anymore. I'm not sure if that's because in this glorious age of the internet, it's too easy to fact-check some of these claims, and young earth creationist grifters realized that they had to adapt to the times and start using better arguments, or at least arguments that are more confusing and can't be debunked in 2 minutes by the average yokel with a cell phone. Or if it's just that I was exposed from an early age to the outermost fringes of an already fringe movement, and anything less extreme than the spiritual equivalent of ancient aliens seems relatively sane by comparison. I don't know if young earth creationist rhetoric has changed all that much or not. I like to think that it has. Maybe recently I've just come to be spoiled by, I can't believe I'm about to say this, the relative integrity of Answers in Genesis apologetics. Maybe the batshit wackadoodle side of young earth creationism is still thriving out there somewhere, if not prominently in the halls of the Creation Museum, then in tiny, isolated homeschool communities, like the one that I grew up in. This seemed like an appropriate time to talk about the deranged beliefs that can crop up when people isolate themselves inside sheltered communities, educating themselves with nothing but a carefully filtered trickle of propaganda that has been selectively filtered to exclusively reinforce their preferred conclusions, concocting elaborate conspiracy theories to explain how the entire rest of the world is involved in a massive cover-up, and how nothing is as it appears to be. The timing feels appropriate because, much as I would like to think that things have gotten better, as I am recording this, mere days ago, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, shared a stage with his Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to suggest that Tylenol may be to blame for autism, and to spread other anti-vaxxer rhetoric and conspiracy theories.
I think I can say that there are certain groups of people that don't take vaccines and don't take any pills that have no autism. Is that a correct statement, by the way?
There are some studies that suggest that, yeah, with the Amish, for example.
The Amish, yeah, virtually. I heard none. See, Bobby wants to be very careful with what he says, and he should, but I'm not so careful with what I say. The FDA will be notifying physicians that the use of well, let's see how we say that. Acetaminophen. Is that okay? So taking Tylenol is not good. If you can't tough it out, if you can't do it, that's what you're going to have to do. You'll take a Tylenol, but it'll be very sparingly. And you shouldn't give the child the Tylenol every time he's born and he goes and has a shot. You shouldn't give a Tylenol to that child.
The President of the United States has given a position in government and is sharing a stage with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man who has never been to medical school, whose claim to fame is spreading wackadoodle conspiracy theories, such as the swine flu having been fabricated by the World Health Organization so that they could sell more vaccines, blaming vaccines in turn for causing autism, spreading misinformation about AIDS, suggesting that rather than merely being transmitted through a virus, it is actually a symptom of drug use, environmental factors, and the gay lifestyle, suggesting that chemicals in the water are turning children gay or transgender, and claiming that they were installing 5G technology to control our behavior.
The World Health Organization, that's really a misnomer. It is absolutely controlled from top to bottom by the pharmaceutical companies, and particularly the vaccine makers, who use WHO to, fabricate pandemics like the swine flu, like the H1N1, and make billions of dollars on pandemics that never happen.
I do believe that autism does come from vaccines.
There's a lot of people that said it's not a virus. The virus is a passenger virus. And these people are dying mainly because of poppers. 100% of the people who died in the first of the first 1,000 who had AIDS were people who were addicted to poppers, which are known to cause Kaposi sarcoma in rats. It's a disease that is environmental, and it's being caused to people who are, who are getting autoimmunity from doing these from toxins.
There's atrazine throughout our water supply. Atrazine, by the way, if you in a lab put atrazine in a tank full of frogs, it will chemically castrate and forcibly feminize every frog in there.
They're putting in 5G to harvest our data and control our behavior.
Of course, Donald Trump is a grifter. He is an idiot who speaks at a 4th grade level.
I know words. I have the best words.
But he does know better. He's a con man who stands for nothing. If the Holy Church of the Rubber Chicken had played an instrumental part in securing enough votes for him to win the election, Trump would have been up on that stage doing the ceremonial dance of the sacred chicken and spreading the hallowed word of the enlightened squeaker. He's a sellout with no agenda of his own. A useful idiot ready to kowtow to whichever persons are best equipped to keep him in power and out of prison. Don't get me wrong, obviously Donald Trump is woefully, staggeringly ignorant, but he doesn't actually think that vaccines and Tylenol are causing autism, nor does he care whether they are or not. Like I said, he's a grifter, a con man, a sexual predator, and a rapist. He neither knows anything about medical care, nor does he give a damn whether your child is born with autism or not. By the way, just so you know, whenever you see headlines and snippets from news articles like these, there will be a link to it in the pinned comment below. There's going to be a lot of things linked in the pinned comment, so please do feel free to check that out if you are so inclined. Anyhow, when it comes to Kennedy, that's a slightly different story than with Trump. We can show that Kennedy, rather like Trump, is dishonest and malicious. While Kennedy has no medical training and no formal qualifications for his position whatsoever, he has become quite accomplished at cherry-picking and misrepresenting actual scientific data out of context to support his conspiracy theories. To the point that it is simply not acceptable to suppose that he is merely that ignorant. He has sifted through and compiled enough data to demonstrate that he has clearly done a lot of research. I cannot accept that he is being sincere when he takes data about how much better we have gotten at diagnosing autism and presents those raw numbers out of context as if they indicated an actual increase in autism levels. I think it's obvious that for him to have read up on the research well enough to have the data that he has, for him to misrepresent out of context, he must be deliberately and maliciously lying. However, that being said, I feel like Kennedy's position is a bit more complex than Donald Trump's. Unlike Trump, I strongly suspect that Kennedy has actually bought in on some of his own bullshit. Unlike Trump, Kennedy actually practices some of the things that he preaches, to the detriment of his own health. The guy goes swimming in raw sewage, eats roadkill, and appears to be self-medicating with a blue dye used for cleaning fish tanks. Or does he eat roadkill? He has openly bragged more than once about how he regularly picks up roadkill and takes it home with him to put in his refrigerator, but evidently a campaign spokesperson went on the record, attempting to salvage the situation by claiming that what he actually meant was that he collects roadkill to feed his birds. Either way, somehow, whether it was from eating roadkill or swimming in sewage, he managed to contract a parasitic worm in his brain. Not only does the guy sound like he's talking into a fan and look like a walnut, he has literal brain damage. A worm ate part of his brain. Now, I would never ridicule someone for having brain damage, nor would the manner in which the injury occurred in any way take away from the tragedy of what happened. This is not me saying, he obviously brought this on himself, so he gets no sympathy from me, LOL. This is just me saying, why the fuck is this guy being put in charge of our health? Why would we cast anybody who has no medical experience whatsoever in this role? Least of all, a con man and a fool, whose idiocy is matched only by his corruption. A man who has destroyed his own body by subjecting it to pseudoscientific quackery, and who can't even bring himself to tell the truth when he is under oath. So that is why now feels like an appropriate time for me to make this video. Because as much as it seemed for a little while there as if a lot of the bullshit that was commonplace when I was growing up, or that at least felt commonplace, could not survive in this new glorious age of readily available information, as much as it seemed as if the human race was headed in the right direction, I feel like we have started slipping backwards again. As if the cranks and quacks, whose ideas were just now on the verge of being driven to the most remote, forgotten corners of public awareness, have suddenly come charging back into the spotlight, seeking not only to be normalized, but seeking power and authority to impose their quackery upon others. So today, let's go over some of the wackiest things that I heard growing up in right-wing fundamentalist circles. Let's have a good laugh at the expense of all the insincere charlatans of all generations who have ever popularized inexcusable absurdities. May our irreverent scoffing and the lack of respect that we afford them be like wet socks upon their feet. The first stupid thing that I used to hear all the time, but nobody seems to talk about anymore, are the flash-frozen mammoths. A major keystone of young Earth creationism is the notion that billions of years worth of geological processes actually all occurred in the last 6,000 years, most of it during the 5 months of Noah's flood. A classic piece of evidence that young Earth creationists used to point to is the story of flash-frozen mammoths. The idea was that we can prove that the timeline of millions of years that you find in mainstream science is wrong, and that the Ice Age happened much faster than the scientists say, because we have mammoths that were flash-frozen, who died standing upright with partially chewed leaves in their mouths. The Ice Age came upon us so rapidly that the mammoths turned into solid ice before the leaves even had time to fall out of their mouths. This is one that I bought, hook, line, and sinker. I never really thought about how absurdly cold it would have to be for any large mammal to freeze solid before it had time to hit the ground, and I haven't heard anybody use the frozen mammoth story in a great many years. Here's another one that I was fully bought in on. Ancient batteries. Another concept that is quite common in young Earth creationist circles is the idea that humanity is evolving in reverse, that we were created perfect in the Garden of Eden, and that since then our genetic code has been slowly degrading over time. The notion that we used to be smarter and live longer and be more genetically pure in ancient times has led a number of young Earth creationists to suggest that, surely, as genetically degraded as we have become, we can't be sitting at the peak of technological advances. Surely, our genetically superior ancestors must have accomplished far greater things than we have. They must have discovered and known things that we couldn't even comprehend. Who's to say that they didn't have aircraft and computers and even spaceships back then? Delicate electronic devices like computers probably wouldn't endure for thousands of years anyway, so who's to say that there didn't used to be an ancient, more advanced civilization that we either haven't discovered yet, or that we are simply too degraded as a species to fully comprehend? As evidence of this ancient spacefaring civilization, they would often point to a number of ceramic pots featuring unique metal cores that were discovered in Iraq in the 1930s. It was speculated that the jars used to be filled with vinegar or a similar electrolyte solution so that they might serve as a rudimentary battery. First of all, no evidence was ever found that anyone in the ancient world had ever poured electrolyte solutions into these jars, and nobody ever found any devices that they might have potentially powered. Second of all, the pots only date back to somewhere around 200 CE to 200 BCE, not some long-forgotten, technologically advanced ancient culture that predates recorded history. And last of all, we know that the jars were actually used for storage, because we found shit still stored inside some of them. The idea that these jars ever served as any sort of batteries is rejected by mainstream archaeology as being not only unfounded, but in contradiction to what we do know about them. But that hasn't stopped young Earth creationists and ancient alien enthusiasts from asserting that they were used as batteries, authoritatively, as if it were a matter of fact. On a similar note to the battery story, we also had tales about lost ancient sonic technology, specifically about how ancient peoples, and a few modern-day isolated tribes as well, according to some versions of the story, could literally use the sound waves from strategically placed trumpets to make objects fly. This one kind of tied into the whole they must have had technology so advanced that we couldn't even comprehend it concept that I mentioned earlier. It also went along well with the we don't know for sure how the pyramids were built, so that means we can say it the most outlandish bullshit ever and no one can definitively prove us wrong ancient aliens brand of conspiracy theory. To my family's credit, this is one talking point that my parents did not take seriously. It found its way into our home through a Dennis Peterson science denial VHS tape, and my parents made sure to tell me not to take these stories about people using trumpets to make rocks fly seriously. I don't know why, out of all the bullshit that Dennis Peterson had to say, my parents balked at this one in particular, or why they continued incorporating Dennis Peterson's videos and writings into my homeschooling curriculum after having agreed that he was talking out of his ass when it came to his trumpet stories. Here's another one that we didn't really buy into, that we heard about through a family that we were close to. The idea that the demons that you read about in the Bible were actually yeast. These people were fundamentalist, biblical literalists on everything else. They believed that the earth was 6,000 years old and that Jonah literally got swallowed by a whale, but they believed that demonic possession was just a metaphor for having a yeast infection. And they used to do these extreme purges where they would go on prolonged fasts and follow a strict keto diet in an attempt to drop their blood sugar levels so that they could starve the yeast out of their bodies. And they lost a lot of weight and started having dizzy spells and passing out fairly frequently. And it was terrifying and harmful. Somebody really should have called Child Protective Services on them. Like I said, this wasn't something that myself or my family believed in. We thought these people were acting like absolute lunatics. And in hindsight, I guess we were sitting atop a rather high horse, calling them crazy, while we believed in literal, actual demons. Another weird thing that we heard, and I'm not going to say that we believed it, but it was consistent with the paranoid way that we viewed the world, and we did not discard it outright, was the Takmars, or Takamarks conspiracy theory. I am like 90% certain that I first heard this one from a Kent Hovind seminar that we had on VHS, but I tried to use the Google and the ChatGPT to find some connection between Kent Hovind and the Takmars theory, but I couldn't find anything online. So maybe I'm misremembering, I don't know. If anyone knows whether Hovind was a proponent of the Takmars conspiracy, please let me know, because I'm not going to go through his whole seminar just to make that point. Wherever it came from, the idea was that the New World Order, or the Deep State, or the Illuminati, or the United Nations, or some shit, was preparing for a large-scale invasion to bring about the kingdom of the Antichrist and start rounding up all of the Christians. And they had prepared for this invasion in advance by leaving hidden road signs and secret markers labeling the routes to strategically important targets and stockpiles of resources. Have you ever seen the little stickers that they hide on the backside of street signs? According to the Takmars conspiracy theory, those stickers are coded messages placed there to aid in the great invasion at the end of times. Now, when I first heard about this theory, I started looking for these stickers. As my dad would drive past signs by the side of the road, I would turn back around and try to catch a glimpse of the back of the signs, and I was rather troubled to find that, yes, there were stickers like those in the seminar on the backsides of street signs. Not long after that, I went for a ride on my bicycle, as I was wont to do when I was a young lad, and I pulled up right by a stop sign to get a closer look. And would you look at that? There was nothing on it but a "Don't tamper with government property" warning and a notice of how old the sign was. I guess looking back on it now, that was my first time debunking a conspiracy theory. Obviously, I'm embarrassed that I ever entertained any of this foolishness, but I feel a little better about myself knowing that even back then, sheltered as I was and limited though my resources were, even then I was curious and I was willing to put things that I had been told to the test. Up next, UFOs were demons. This was another one of Dennis Peterson's ideas, and while I think to say that I believed it might be too strong of a word, this idea made a lot of sense to me. How are UFOs most frequently described? As lights in the sky. What does Lucifer mean? Lightbringer. From the perspective of a Christian fundamentalist, inspiring fear and giving people a reason to think that life on Earth is not all that special, that we are just another planet on which life formed rather than being the jewel of God's creation, that sounded just like the sort of thing that demons would want to do. Now, I never went as far down the aliens are demons rabbit hole as some people have done. For years now, there has been a whole deep chum bucket full of conspiracy theories centering around demonic bodies having been recovered from crash sites, attempting to weave demons into the classic alien autopsy and abduction narratives. These fringe ideas have become increasingly mainstream as Republicans have repeatedly pushed for and chaired congressional hearings, inviting some rather colorful characters to testify so they can discuss the possibility of otherworldly crash materials and the recovery of interdimensional non-human biologicals. This one may warrant its own video someday. The rabbit hole runs truly deep on this one. There's a lot to be said about the claims that were made in these hearings, the people who made them, and how it all ties into Christian nationalist propaganda, modern-day far-right demonology, and MAGA deep state conspiracy theories. Suffice it to say, I used to seriously entertain the idea that UFOs were demons, putting on light shows in the sky in an effort to make us feel less important. It seems silly now, but it made sense at the time. Up next, and on a related note, we have lizard people and /or the Nephilim. This one kind of runs adjacent to the aliens are actually demons conspiracy theory, and like the alien demon theory, even when I was a believer, this one struck me as being a bit too silly to take seriously. This is another rabbit hole that runs too deep to address properly without dedicating a full video to it, but for now, we will simply say that there is a long-standing conspiracy theory that everyone who has any amount of power or influence on this planet, that includes all politicians, all prominent wealthy businessmen, all persons in media or entertainment, they're all either shape-shifting aliens or they are human-alien hybrids. Christian fringe movements have adopted this long-standing theory. They have inserted their aliens are actually demons lore and thus appropriated the alien shapeshifter theory into a more spiritualized, demonic entity / Christian persecution narrative. Like I said, this one always struck me as being a bit too silly. What was rather lost on me at the time were the dangerous undertones of this theory. The idea that some people, specifically the people that you don't like, aren't even human in the same sense that you are. That they are genetically impure from bloodlines that have been corrupted by demon seed, and that this makes these entities evil by nature from birth. It's literally repackaged neo-Nazi far-right race realist propaganda with an extra dollop of ancient alien-style bullshit on the top. I used to think that the Nephilim shapeshifter conspiracy theory was funny. Now, as I watch the Republican Party become more openly aligned with Nazi ideology and embrace increasingly violent and dehumanizing rhetoric and propagandize about how certain races are poisoning the bloodline of our nation, it no longer strikes me as being funny. Rather, it strikes me as being just another expression of the amoral, dehumanizing, nationalistic mentality that is the rot at the core of the modern-day conservative movement. Speaking of genetic purity, this brings us to our next topic, telegony, the debunked idea that once a purebred female dog has mated with a male mutt, she is no longer of any use as a breeding dog because every litter that she bears will be the offspring of, and contain genetic material from, every male dog that she has ever mated with over the course of her lifetime. I didn't hear this one until I was already a teenager, and by that time, thank goodness, I knew enough about basic biology to call bullshit on it. But rather like the dehumanizing, some bloodlines are infused with demon seed, neo-Nazi-infused rhetoric, I didn't fully grasp the implications of this talking point until years later. The most obvious function of this talking point is to justify the misogynistic incel mindset of men who have multiple sexual partners are like unto the mighty hunters of old, conquering and forever altering the very identity of women with their noble seed. Whereas women who sleep around are irreparably damaged, soiled, and dirty, to the point that if you sleep with her, you might as well be exchanging bodily fluids with every other man she has ever slept with. And that's just gay! It's all about controlling and demeaning women, degrading them as whores for their sexuality, while simultaneously diminishing their worth to that of mere sexualized, childbearing flesh puppets. That is the most basic function of this particular bit of pseudo-scientific propaganda. But there was another layer to it in the context in which I first heard of it. I was raised as a member of the Messianic Jewish cult. What is that? Well, for us, we were essentially evangelicals who felt that we were God's chosen people, the new Jews, as it were, and as such, all of the Jewish commandments. Don't kindle a fire on the Sabbath day, abstain from eating for 24 hours on Yom Kippur, and go on a week-long camping trip for Sukkot, applied to us. Our faith was very much in line with the typical born-again, praise Jesus evangelical, but how we worshipped was based on the commandments and rituals of the Old Testament. And we very much considered ourselves to be Jews, at least in God's eyes. Now, some people who identify themselves as Messianic Jews are actual Jews who have become Christians. And some were from non-Jewish families, but they argued that they were Jewish by blood nonetheless. How does that work? Well, the idea is that God's chosen people were the Jews. If you accept Jesus Christ, or Yeshua HaMashiach, as they would say, as your Lord and Savior, then you are evidently chosen by God. Ergo, you must be of the Jewish bloodline in some distant way, whether you realized it or not. Which is why telegony was such a big deal to these people. If you were born into an atheistic, non-Jewish family, and you came to Christ, then evidently your parents were part Jewish all along, even if they didn't know it. Because you only had the capacity to come to Christ, if, diluted though your bloodline may be, you were, at least in some small measure, part of God's sacred chosen people. Most of the people in the congregation I found myself attending were white people of evident European descent, and some of these white European people felt that they were a part of some lost white tribe of Israel, and that their white European bloodline was blessed and chosen. To these people, it was a great sin for a woman of their white, supposedly Jewish race to have sex either with a non-believer or with a foreigner, because, on top of the misogynistic incel implications of telegony, they had added an extra layer of racism. If you personally were saved, but not everyone related to you was saved, then that was because of the impurity in your family's bloodline. And if you, as a white, make-believe Jewish girl, were to sleep with, say, a black man from outside of your church, then you were further diluting the worthiness of your family's bloodline. You were making yourself even less pure. And if you were to ever have children, even if you had them years later by an upstanding white man from your church, they would still be part black and a little less likely to have even the capacity of having faith in Jesus. Consider how dangerous this concept is. Aside from the delusional levels of superiority and self-importance, it suggests that there are some families out there who have dirty blood. People that are dehumanized to the point that not only do these Messianic Jews refuse to mix with them, but their children, their newborn infants, are viewed as having been cursed and damned, evil by their very nature. Again, this is just repackaged Nazi ideology, this time, in a case of bitter irony, masquerading in talits and yarmulkes, robbing actual Jews of their culture before turning around and questioning the purity of their bloodlines because, if you're really Jewish now, then how come you don't believe in Yeshua HaMashiach? It's grotesque and vile, and I am grateful that for all of the stupid things that my family and I and the people in our Messianic Jewish congregation believed, that particular ideology was limited to a small pocket within a relatively small subsection of our group. A stupid thing that, unfortunately, I did take seriously was the discovery of giant skeletons. I wasn't even aware that there was anything controversial about these reported discoveries. I just thought that these were discoveries that had been made that mainstream reporting just didn't talk about as much as they should. This was a conspiracy theory that was largely founded on images that, when reverse searched on the internet, turned out to have been stolen from a Photoshop contest. I had no idea that these images were fake at the time. The giant bones narrative made sense to me based on what little I knew about the world. The Bible talked about how there used to be giants back in the day, and it talked about how very different people were biologically back then and how we could live for centuries, which tied in with our understanding of genetic entropy and how mankind was a perfect genetically superior creation that has become genetically degraded since then, and holy shit, we're talking about genetic purity again. Now, obviously, I picked up on the racist undertones of the aliens are demons / there are bloodlines that are tainted by Nephilim DNA conspiracy theory and the once a bitch breeds with a mutt all of her pups will be mutts rhetoric years ago, but it didn't fully occur to me until I started getting my notes together for this video how very central the concept of genetic purity and of a mythical golden age before our genes were corrupted back when we were still pure-blooded ubermensch really is to the standard original sin and fall of man narrative as it is typically presented in Answers in Genesis style apologetics. Overall, this list has gotten to be a bit more serious than what I had originally intended when I set out to make this video. So let's end this list on a fun note. Let's talk about the giant tomatoes. Here is what we can show to be true. About 300 million years ago, during the Carboniferous period, the Earth was overgrown with giant swamps and forests. This flourishing mass of vegetation led to increased levels of oxygen, which, along with other factors, contributed to the development of insects of remarkable dimensions. Of course, in young Earth creationism, the name of the game is pretending to be confused by simple things and making shit up. So of course they had to come up with some bullshit to explain the rampant vegetation and the giant bugs. What they came up with was, what if all life on Earth just naturally grows to gigantic sizes, and something toxic in our modern-day environment is stopping them from reaching that potential today? What if harmful rays from the sun are stunting the growth of plants and animals? What if, back before the flood of Noah, there was a barrier of ice surrounding the globe, a firmament, if you will, that was transparent enough to allow the light to come through, but opaque enough to filter out the harmful radiation? Now, I want you to think about what an orbit is and how it works. Gravity is pulling the moon toward the Earth. Why doesn't the moon just fall into the Earth? Because it is traveling at great speed. Its velocity is sending it away from the Earth. Why doesn't it just fly off into the distance? Because the moon is trapped in a sort of balancing act, where the moon's velocity isn't quite enough to overcome the force of gravity, and the gravity isn't quite enough to pull the moon into the Earth. So rather than flying away, the moon is spiraling away, very slowly. So slowly that it appears to simply be hanging over our heads. Rather like if you were to tie a potato to an elastic band and spin around with it. If you compare the potato's centrifugal force to the moon's lateral velocity and think of the pull of the elastic band as gravity, then an orbit is the balance of forces between the velocity at which the elastic band would snap, sending the potato flying, and the point of tension where the tug of the elastic band would be enough to overcome the velocity and return the potato to your hand. That being said, how the hell is ice wall egg Earth supposed to work? What holds it in orbit? How does the ice just encase the Earth on all sides whilst moving around the sun with it in lockstep? Forgive me for that. I know I said this wasn't going to be a debunking video, and we're only addressing the ice wall because it's relevant to the tomato story, but just, Jesus Christ, Dennis, have you no shame? The story of the giant tomatoes, as it is told by conspiracy theorists like Kent Hovind, is generally some variation of the following. Years ago, in the distant and mysterious land of Japan, a man decided to grow a cherry tomato plant in his basement. Realizing that his plant wasn't going to make it without sunlight, the man ran a fiber optic cable down into his basement to provide his tomatoes with a natural, albeit unwittingly filtered, source of sunlight. For reference, cherry tomatoes are generally speaking about the size of cherries. This right here is what an average run-of-the-mill cherry tomato looks like. This is important because, according to Kent Hovind, after 2 years, his cherry tomato plant was 16 feet tall and produced 900 tomatoes, and his tomatoes on his cherry tomato plant were baseball-sized. Let's really quick address the truth of this claim. There was a Japanese man named Dr. Mori who is credited as being the inventor of the Himawari solar lighting system. Himawari's specialty, it would seem, was using fiber optics to channel natural solar light into enclosed areas. Though this service would appear to have been predominantly marketed to homes and office spaces, they do mention that their services are ideal for providing light to enclosed hydroponic operations. The kernel of truth that Kent Hovind and his ilk seem to be running with here is that Himawari does boast about how its lighting is ultraviolet free, and it does venture to say that, quote, ultraviolet rays could be factors responsible for mutations and growth failure, end quote. And evidently there was a point where NASA acknowledged Dr. Mori's work and suggested that it could be worth further investigation. What you do not find is any official documentation of Kent Hovind's wild, hyperbolic claim about Dr. Mori growing cherry tomatoes the size of baseballs. And when it comes to Hovind's other grandiose claims about how after 2 years the cherry tomato plant was 16 feet tall and had produced 900 tomatoes, out of curiosity, I asked ChatGPT how tall a typical hydroponic greenhouse-grown cherry tomato plant will grow in a year, and it said that if they are trellised and pruned down to a singular growth point, they will reach a length of 15 to 20 feet in a single year. I also asked about how many individual tomatoes a cherry tomato plant will produce in a year, and it said 500 to 1,000. So not only did Kent Hovind seemingly pull that detail about baseball-sized cherry tomatoes out of his ass, but he evidently tried to embellish the story by throwing around what sounded like big numbers to him, like 16 feet in 2 years and 900 tomatoes in 2 years, seemingly unaware that a perfectly normal greenhouse-grown cherry tomato plant can get taller than that and produce more than that, not in 2 years, but in a single year. Now, there was a whole other layer to this bullshit that I remember hearing about. I thought I had heard about it from Dennis Peterson, or possibly from Kent Hovind, but I can't find an example of either one of them saying it, so I have no idea where I heard about this part of it. But somebody said that this particular oversized tomatoes in the Japanese basement experiment was actually very easy to replicate. You didn't even need to install fiber optic cables. All you needed was a roll of pink saran wrap. The plastic would be transparent enough to let the light through, but the pink dye would provide just enough opacity to block the sun's harmful rays. So guess what I did? I grew a little tomato plant of my own in the family garden, and I built a little teepee over top of it out of sticks entwined, and I encircled the whole thing in pink plastic wrap. The results of this experiment? Inconclusive. I was a kid building a teepee out of plastic wrap. One gust of breeze and my experiment was gone with the wind. Like I said at the start of this video, it seems to me like things have gotten better in the world, what with the internet and all. It's just too hard these days to say something like, they used a trumpet to make the rocks fly, and not have somebody pull out their phone and start fact-checking that shit. I don't know. Maybe that's just how it looks from my own subjective viewpoint. Maybe the internet has made things even worse. But I feel like it's gotten better. Though I am worried that things won't stay better for long. The same people who are trying to convince us that vaccines and Tylenol cause autism, and that we need them to save us from the perils of over-the-counter medicine, are also trying to seize control of higher education in the United States, forcing universities to insert far-right propaganda into their curriculums, under threat of being stripped of their funding and being forced to close down. We are on the verge of living in a country in which what constitutes higher education is about to be redefined to suit the whims of conmen and conspiracy theorists. This is the same regime that has created a banned words list in an attempt to hinder scientific advancement in certain fields. They literally have a list of forbidden words, so that if someone submits a research paper on, for example, viruses that includes terminology like cell barrier, your research will be censored and your funding terminated. Don't be duped by these hucksters. If people on the right actually believe that climate change was a hoax, and that AIDS was a hoax, and that COVID-19 was a hoax, and that transgender and intersex people didn't exist, they would want more and better science related to those issues. The fact that they are trying to censor the science, and that they were willing to put American lives at risk by stripping funding away from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, in a desperate attempt to cripple climate change research in the United States, just goes to prove what we already know, that they know that they are full of shit. And they know that further research will continue to bear out the fact that they are full of shit. We have talked before about how advocating for right-wing policies is mostly just pretending to be confused about things. What this is a criminal regime actively attempting to kneecap science and education so they can create an entire generation of people who are genuinely as confused as right-wing activists pretend to be. Because these clowns know that it is only through public ignorance that they can hope to stay in power. Not only is this lawless regime well on its way to crippling scientific progress and effectively ending authentic education in the United States, now we have entered an era in American history in which they are openly and brazenly rounding people up without due process and shipping them off to die in literal concentration camps. If this was actually about legally removing criminal immigrants from the United States, You know, like Joe Biden did in his term in office, when, according to the official numbers released by the Department of Homeland Security, Biden removed well over twice as many immigrants as Trump did in his first term? If that were what this was actually about, then there would have been no need to suspend due process. No, this is about rounding up legal, American-born citizens and putting them into camps. When there is no due process, it no longer matters whether you are here legally or not. All the administration has to do is point an accusatory finger at anybody that they don't like, and they will no longer have the right to present an argument in their own defense. This is not me being hyperbolic or speculative. Donald Trump has admitted repeatedly that rounding up American citizens and shipping them off to concentration camps overseas is the end goal here.
Homegrown criminals next. Yeah. I said homegrowns are next. The homegrowns built. You got to build about 5 more places.
Yeah, that's big.
We also have homegrown criminals, absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country.
No less terrifying is the fact that recently the Trump regime declared Antifa to be a terrorist organization. I call that terrifying because Antifa, as an organization, does not exist. Antifa is primarily a slang term that is used by people on the right to label various unconnected persons and groups who have expressed anti-fascist points of view. I have publicly and repeatedly expressed anti-fascist ideas on the internet. In this very video that you are watching now, I have expressed anti-fascist views. By the only definition for Antifa that exists in reality, I am Antifa. As someone who has been designated a domestic terrorist by a criminal regime which illegally rounds up its own citizens without due process, I don't know how long I can keep doing this. I don't feel safe doing this. But this is not the time for us to be silent. We are living through history right now, and we are all of us going to be written about in the history books someday. Perhaps not individually, by name, but they will write about all of us who live in the United States collectively in one of several very broad strokes. They will write about how some people wanted an authoritarian theocracy, and how they voted for it, and cheated and lied for it. They will write about some people who weren't necessarily happy about what was going on, but didn't care enough to try to actually do anything about it. Then they will write about a handful of us who stood up and spoke out, and remained loudly and proudly defiant to the end. I don't want to be written about as someone who just held his tongue and let his country fall into tyranny without protest. I don't want to be remembered as someone who
masked his voice on the internet, or who kept his face hidden. I want to be remembered as someone who declared proudly and openly, "My name is David. I am anti-fascist, and I will stand up and speak out and defy this criminal regime until I am no longer able to do so."